On this episode of the Spiritable podcast, we have on Dr. Erica Hyatt.
Erica Goldblatt Hyatt.
Erica Goldblatt Hyatt. There you go. I stand corrected. And what are we talking about?
We're talking about near-death experiences, after-death communication, death anxiety, this whole concept of freedom and science and fact versus truth.
Oh, we're getting into it.
We're getting into it.
We also talked about some of our personal experiences with death and near-death experiences, if you can call them that. Just sort of our personal experience with what death means to us. So if any of that interests you, check it out.
Keep on watching. Hi, I'm Luke.
I'm Richard.
And this is the Spiritable podcast.
We're having conversations about big spiritual, moral, and social issues in hopefully a more grounded way.
We talk a lot from the religious philosophy of this guy, Emanuel Swedenborg, and our own twist on Christianity. Check out episode 9 for more on that.
But of course, we don't have all the answers. So we like to bring on guests with their own philosophies.
Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, atheist, etc.
To help get new perspectives and to challenge each other's beliefs.
Everyone has some relationship with spirituality, but for some dumb reason it can be hard to talk about.
And everyone's experience with life is going to be a little different, and that's what makes it so interesting.
So, thanks for joining us on Spiritable. All right, Erica, I'm going to do my best to give a little life summary of you up to this point.
Okay.
We'll see how I do.
Okay,
So,
we'll see where you miss it.
So you started post-college in social work, you moved away into counseling, working in hospitals and academia and universities. You wrote a book.
I did.
In 2015 called Grieving for the Sibling You Lost.
Yes.
For a self-help book for bereaved teens, which is
Yes.
pretty cool. You then moved more into academia and research and clinical work, focusing around Thanatology, which is my word for the day. Very fun word, which is the study of death and the practices associated with it, which is really interesting. And did your research in near-death communication, and also through that were an advocate for women's reproductive rights.
That's right.
And kind of blended those two to having some of your clinical practice around the universal human experience of death, as well as helping women who have had pregnancy losses due to fetal anomalies
Yes.
and such. So
Yeah.
does that sound like an accurate depiction of you up to
Sounds
this
pretty
point?
good,
And now
yeah.
you're at Rutgers, right? Directing their
Yeah.
social work program?
Yeah, I'm the assistant director of the Doctorate of Social Work at Rutgers, but I also have 2 sites of private practice. One of them is here in Bryn Athyn, and so I work with grieving teens, I work with kids that are questioning their sexuality, and then also downtown in Society Hill, I work with women that have ended pregnancies, and I also work with people grieving.
Wow. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you still did clinical work at this point.
I do, I have to.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to be with the people.
Yeah,
absolutely.
well, I think there's a fun mix there between your university sort of academic life and then the very hands-on clinical work. 'Cause
Yes.
that's something I find for myself is like I need both sort of things or else I don't feel as useful.
For sure. For me, I feel the most useful when I'm working directly with people, and sometimes that's in counseling, and sometimes that's just like in teaching.
Yeah.
You get really jazzed when you're teaching and you see people learning and they're excited and you're giving them new ideas and things just kind of start going. So that human connection is really important.
That's true.
Like,
Richard, if you had to pick in your ministerial duties between like teaching, religion, or more writing, research-based stuff, where would you go? 'Cause I think I know what you would do.
Oh yeah, definitely teaching.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very people driven. I am very much, I get my energy from people. I don't get my energy from being alone doing things. I hate doing anything by myself. My brother's the same way. Ben behind the camera is the same way. Doing this alone, why would you? It's terrible.
I
It's
think there's
miserable.
use in it.
I changed that way too. It was like 3 years ago. I was like, wait, being alone is garbage. And
Yeah,
then
it's
started-
trash. Why would anyone ever want to be alone? The more you're
Get used to
alone,
it.
the more you get sad. That's my experience.
Sounds like you need
I just
some
need to
work.
fight
Sounds like
the
we need a
sadness
session.
away.
Just push it. Just
No, but it sounds unhealthy. But I think I do. Just a lot of my happiness comes from being with people, and that's where I feel most of my usefulness. So when I spend long periods of time by myself, I'm like, haven't done anything worthwhile in so long.
But that's it, okay? That's you haven't found your use in being alone yet, because you're going to find something that you're doing that is valuable that you can only do by yourself that then you will provide to people. Like, writing or, I don't know, you've got to find it.
That's a $40 copay, Richard.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next week.
Good thing I did this before I lost my insurance.
Well, I think people have a hard time being alone. And I think there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Right?
Yeah.
Because you can be
Yeah.
alone and be totally content. And I have some patients and some students that I work with that really, they're those introverts that need to recharge. And then I have people that when they're alone, they feel lonely. And so I think there's like a difference there. But I think there's some real satisfaction that comes in solitary work. For me, it's writing. For me, when I'm writing a poem or I'm writing an article, it's harder and it's different work. But knowing that it's going to be useful to people kind of keeps me going.
Yeah, I find when I'm writing sermons,
Yeah.
I enjoy being by myself to do that. But immediately when I'm done, I want to read it to someone.
Yeah.
I'm like, someone look at, I did this, someone, see it. And
So now someone's just
Validation
trapped
and
for 5 minutes.
I have to get out of clinical mode.
You gotta decompress somehow.
Right.
yeah.
All right. Well, should we get into death? Should we jump right in?
I thought for a second that was a Freudian slip and you wanted to say, let's get into depth. And I'm
Into
like,
depth,
oh,
into the
but
depth
no,
of
we're
death.
getting into death.
Yeah.
Yes, let's talk about it. You would
Well-
not believe the conversations I can kill by saying
Was
that
kill
I
a
am...
Freudian slip?
It was definitely not. It was fully intentional. My Freudian slips are never death-related. They're usually life-related. So that's kind of the weird thing. Death is always on my mind.
Death is always
Yes.
nice. Well, on your LinkedIn, it said that you're a notable figure in Thanatology. I'm gonna slip that word
You
in
looked
wherever I
you looked
can.
up her LinkedIn.
I did. I did
People
my
use
research
LinkedIn
today.
still?
I think
I'm
they
afraid
do.
so.
Professionals.
Wow.
Grown-ups, yeah. Once you start adulting like I do, you know.
What?
Yeah.
Adults, Richard.
I'm sorry that I went into an education that has job security, so I don't need a LinkedIn.
Apology accepted. Yeah, so I kind of want to know where your particular fascination with death came from. And death is something everyone thinks about, obviously, and some are more interested than others. Some are scared about it. Some are sort of have this weird anticipation for it. So what's your background with death?
Yeah, I've done a lot of sharing my story and a lot of writing about it because you said everyone thinks about it. It's true. Everyone thinks about it, but nobody really wants to talk about it. It's kind of like this secret that we all keep, that we're all going to die, but humans have this capability to think we're going to live forever, that we are the one exception and we're going to beat the cancer or we're going to live into our hundreds or whatever it is. But we are all mortal, we all die. And I established this awareness pretty early in my life, probably around age 6 or 7. There was kind of this aha moment for me, lying in bed late
Very
at night. I was very young. And I think a lot of it is genetic because it's associated with anxiety, and that runs in my family. I had this aha moment of like, I'm not going to live forever. Holy shit, I'm not going to live forever.
Yeah.
And I ran into my parents' room and I was like, Mom, Dad, and I woke them up. I was like, I'm going to die.
And they're like, honey, is it okay? To the hospital.
I mean, they really thought that there was something wrong. And
Yeah.
then they started to realize that I was talking existentially. So I was this really existential child and I was just chased by thoughts of death. You know, the first time I remember getting on an airplane with my dad, I was like, Dad, I have a bad feeling this plane is going to crash. And my dad was like, oh my goodness, is my daughter psychic? Oh,
Yeah,
gosh,
that
should
would
we not-"
freak me
And then
out.
he realized I said it every time we got on the plane. So I had this real death anxiety, which has the clinical name thanatophobia. And people do experience it. And so I didn't think that it was normal. I saw myself as an outsider. No one else seemed to be worrying that they were going to die. And I felt like I carried this really heavy, nasty secret. So I really wanted to explore the afterlife. I was born into a Reformed Jewish family. And my parents offered some explanations from Judaism. And then they were still dissatisfying to me. So I started studying world religions in college and undergrad. And by the end of my undergrad experience, I knew that I had to get really, really close to death. I was like, if I'm going to be this scared, because I would have these panic attacks about what happens when we die and where do we go and is there a soul? And so when I chose to go into social work, it was a lot. I knew the only way that I would be okay was to actually work as close to death as I could, work with the dying. And so I decided to start working in end of life. And yeah, here I am today. And what's funny is I was on Dr. Oz a couple of weeks ago, and they called me a death expert. And I thought that was hilarious because
It's
the
the
whole
most
reason...
metal term I've ever heard.
Death expert, right? But you know, like the whole reason why I got into it is because I don't feel like I know enough. I feel like a death novice, and I'm constantly trying to learn and accumulate knowledge. I mean, the idea of being a death expert is that you have all the answers, but I have all the questions. So I feel like it's this really weird identification of what I do.
The more you learn, the less you know, kind of.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
When you were just talking about how everyone thinks about death, I don't know if I've gotten to the place you got when you were 6 yet. I said, like, I'm gonna be honest.
That's Ben's issue as well. Ben just thinks he's going to live forever and nothing can kill him.
Yeah, well,
and Ben's just like, oh,
Hey,
why
you
not?
live
live
forever.
what I'm always saying is that if you're in your mid-20s, you should be challenging the universe to kill you.
No.
Anything.
It's dangerous that statistically we know that you are still in your mid-20s, you're an adolescent, and that is the highest time of physical health and also the highest time of mortality, because most people die because their brains are novice seeking and sensation and stimulation seeking. So it's all downhill from here.
She's not supporting
No,
it.
it's definitely not supporting risk taking or.
Man's like, yay, me! See, I used to be more thrill-seeking, and I've recently, honestly, the moment I realized, this is going to get sappy for a minute, get prepared. The moment I realized how much I cared about Sonia, my fiance, was the moment I became scared of doing dangerous things. Because when it was just me, I was like, whatever. Like, I don't know, I'm bouldering up this 100-foot cliff, and if I fall, like, I don't know, whatever. People will be sad for a bit, they'll get over it. But now, like, if I think about dying, I'm like, oh my goodness, what would that do to her? I can't, like, can't mess around with that.
That's really common. That's so in the field of thanatology, we try to understand when people start thinking about death and worrying about death, and usually people in their kind of later 20s, and once they start engaging in these meaningful relationships, that's when thanatophobia spikes. I was very abnormal. Most kids have thoughts of death, but they don't have the anxiety. But, I talked to friends of mine that I knew in my teens that have started families, and they're like, so that whole death phobia thing that you had, now that I have kids, I get it, because I don't want to leave anyone behind, and I care about them so much, and so now I'm having that, which is much more normal.
My sister and I had sort of the opposite ends of that sort of thing. She was kind of like you, at a young age, so scared that I was going to die, that my parents were going to die, and like every day she'd be like, Mommy, are you going to die? And like, no, but yes, someday, like, we don't know how to have this conversation.
Right.
And I was just terrified and very anxious about the afterlife itself. Like, I would be a kid and like crying to myself at night just because I couldn't comprehend eternity, which no one can. But like, I was like, how I can't be in heaven forever. What's that going to be like? I'm so scared. So we definitely had some weird freakouts there as kids. So I'm on that same wavelength.
Yeah.
So I realized my mortality.
Like, I don't get it.
When I was a kid, I was just like running around doing kid things. I don't know.
Oh, that's so great, so pure, so pure. You're what we would call a new soul. There, we were like old souls, and you were a new soul.
Oh yeah, no one has ever called me an old soul.
Yeah. I think I hit my like peak stress and anxiety when I was like 11, and from there I'm like, I'm better now.
You peaked early.
I peaked early in a bad way.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to talk to you about was a cool thing I found in your history, which is research you did from 2014 to 2016 on communication of the dying. And I just read a little blurb about it, so I don't know like what conclusions you came to. But it sounded really interesting, just seeing what people on the edge of life and death said and what that means.
Yeah,
so I'm
there's
curious.
So many pieces to it to tell you about. And I was really fortunate to be at Bernathen College at the time, because there's this rich history of inquiry into things like life after death and communication and kind of, is there even a language of the dying? So I hooked up with at the time she was a linguist, her name's Lisa Smart, and she had been at the deathbed of her father, and she had noticed he'd said these really strange, bizarre things as he was dying, and she wrote them down.
Like other language? Like
sometimes it was nonsense.
Kind of like speaking in tongues or something?
Yeah, so sometimes it was unintelligible stuff, like nonsense stuff. But a lot of the stuff that she noticed as a linguist, Money Penny, like Alex Trebek on Celebrity Jeopardy.
Linguist.
Right. Anyway, she noticed that there were these categories of speech that her father was using, and some of them were metaphor, some of them were he was talking about modes of transportation or momentous moments happening or repeating things over and over, and she thought, I wonder how common this is. And so she started the Final Words Project. And when I heard about her work, she was basically collecting anecdotal, which is not formal research. She was just kind of asking people to share their stories, and she was categorizing these types of speech. Now, I came in having worked as a person mostly in oncology and cancer care with both adults and little ones, and I'd been at a lot of deathbeds, and I noticed as well some trends, some different things happening with children, but definitely similar things happening with adults. And she actually connected with this guy, Raymond Moody, who is kind of the father of the near-death experience, this physician who really coined the term, and they had a number of thoughts about what do these final words mean? Can we categorize a speech? And I said, why don't we try to do some formal research? Why don't we write down what people are saying as they die, of course, with their consent? Most of the work, unfortunately, never got off the ground. We really didn't raise enough money to do the work. So we have a lot of hypotheses, and there's a wonderful book that Lisa wrote called Words at the Threshold. And I wrote an article. My work ended up kind of veering into hospice care and how we can help people as they're dying. So I wrote an article kind of based on that. But the categories of language are really fascinating. And the kind of overarching spiritual question is, are we really hearing nonsense when people die? Or is what we think is nonsense actually reflecting a language of the afterlife? So, and this was the piece that scientists and people that reviewed our research protocol didn't even want to touch, because there's no way to measure objectively, just like there's no way to measure a near-death experience. You know, so if you believe that your soul has left the body, there's no way to use human tools, objective tools, to measure that. So is this a language of the afterlife? Is this actually reflecting a transition in consciousness? Are we watching consciousness leave the body and take up space amongst us that we just can't see? So there's that kind of ethereal piece to it. And then there was just that over and over again. And people from all around the world would say, yeah, you know, my father spoke in threes as he was dying. Or, you know, my mother referred to taking the train, or she used this strange kind of mixed up language where up was down and down was up. And, you know, we were trying to decipher. And I think the message that we wanted to get across with even starting the research was, don't be afraid to sit at the bedsides of the loved ones, of your loved ones as they die.
Space with them.
Yeah, go into that space with them. I mean, the thing that was also interesting for me is I used to work with really psychotic people that were schizophrenic and kind of departed from reality. And there's a real fear of going into the reality of a psychotic person. And I found that in my social work, in my clinical work, if I engaged in their reality, they were speaking in metaphor. There was a way to connect what they were saying in their worlds back to our world, and we could join together. So there's this fear of the unknown, and especially of language that's frightening or unusual. But I think if we run towards it instead of away from it, then I think actually it can connect us. Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah. Oh, thank
Well,
you.
nice. It's fun. I like having this podcast as a platform to talk about kind of weird stuff.
Yeah.
Because last episode, or the episode that just came out as of this recording date, was one with Chris Barber where we talked about human sexuality.
Oh, nice.
And that's just not like a topic that people are. It's kind of a taboo subject. People don't really discuss it in an open way.
Yes.
So it's cool bringing those out to light, kind of.
Yes, we need to talk about this stuff. You know, the more you avoid talking about things, first of all, the more you think about them. It's like that old, don't think of a pink elephant. You're gonna think of a pink elephant. The more you suppress things, they're gonna pop out. But also there can be misunderstandings, especially when it comes to sexuality, especially when it comes to death. Things that people fear don't need to be things that they're afraid of if they actually talk and ask questions.
Yeah. Death is still something that doesn't feel like super real to me. And I'm pretty okay
As
with
we
it.
revealed.
I'm just like, whatever. It doesn't need to feel real to me right now. At least for myself.
Sure.
And I remember I worked in experiential learning class with you, was in an old folks home.
Yeah.
And it was just fascinating, the change in the way that people talked about death there. Like a woman leaving to get an operation done was like, wish me luck, I hope I make it back. And I was like, what, make it back for, she just means make it back. Oh, weird. And that was just like,
Kind of reframe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sent me reeling for a second because I was like, her tone of voice was not what I expected for someone saying like, might never see any of you again. It was very strange. But getting used to that as much as a 23-year-old at the time could, was super valuable for me, just to see that like, this is a reality in their life and it's not something that they're constantly terrified of. It's just part of living for them. Just then, there's a woman that I spent about an hour and a half with, just talking to, and at the end of the meeting, as I was leaving, I was saying goodbye, and she was like, thank you so much. Like, I'm really glad that I had time to do this. And I sort of didn't get what she
Didn't
meant.
process it.
And I was sort of like, oh yeah, I mean, it's like...
Me
it's
too.
Like,
See ya.
It's like 6 o'clock. We had like an hour and a half. Yeah, I'm glad we had time too. And that's not what she meant, because 2 days later she passed away.
Wow.
And I didn't realize how close she was to dying, but she obviously did, and was like, in her last 36 hours of life, was really glad that she spent an hour and a half of it with me, which was just like, I had to sit with that for a while.
Yeah.
And be like, how much did I value that time while it was happening? And how much was I just like, I'm talking to some old lady that's kind of lonely. It's good that I can help her, but like, how much was I really present in one of 36 hours that she had left?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, made me really reframe what spending time with people means when someone has really limited time left.
Mm-hmm.
And in actuality, we think of that time as more valuable because there isn't much of it left.
Right.
But it's the same amount of time that we'll probably be spending right now. It's the same amount of time that I'll be eating dinner tonight. Like, it's the same time.
Right.
And I just had like 2 weeks where I was like, I throw so much time away.
Mm-hmm.
I throw so much time away. I'm so not present in so much that I do.
Yes.
And that was really important for me to grapple with last year, which was really, and I mean, still grappling with. Probably will be grappling with the next 40 years of my life.
Yeah, but that's huge. I mean, I really think that the existential lesson in that as well is that, you know, none of us knows how much time we have left. And it's so cliche, like we hear that all the time, like you never know when you're going to go. But when you think about your hours being limited, then time is so precious, and you really want to be in the moment, and you want to be intentional, and you want to tell people that you love them. I mean, all those cheesy things that older people say, they try to pass down this wisdom, it's because they're realizing that their time is precious. And these are things we can do in our lives right now. I think the gift of that as well for you being in that environment last year was you got to see these people who are, they're people of great faith. And so they're people that don't fear death. And that's not always what you see in people that are elderly. You see, you know, in the community we live in, there's a lot of social support for them. There's a lot of practical support. They live really well and really well cared for. Many of them still have families visit, and they're still independent enough that they don't need to be in a more medically intensive environment. So you actually got to see what all of us hope to get at the end of our lives. And unfortunately, in this country, there's far more elderly that die in poverty, or that die with regrets, or that don't have the community connection or just the faith in God that these people have. So you really got to see the ideal end of life situation. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never thought about it quite like that, but yeah.
Yeah, Erica, one question I think I had for you from that is the faith aspect. So you've been around a lot of people who are near-death experiencing that, or talking about it, have had a family member with that. How have people who have had faith going into death versus not having faith going into that, how does that experience differ for people? Because I know for my grandpa's a really interesting case, and he's never going to listen to this probably. Love him to death. Pun not intended. But he is he's a non-believing guy. He's very old. He's like 95 at this point or something. He had a near-death experience when he was 20-something. Oh, and to back this up, near-death experience is where someone has... you could explain it better than I could, so I'm just going to throw that over to you real quick.
So someone is clinically dead, which means that there is no more blood flow or oxygen to the brain. The heart stops beating. There is no electric activity in the brain. So they appear clinically, by medical standards, dead. So usually we say time of death is when the heart stops beating and all of that blood flow stops. What's interesting is there have been some studies trying to actually figure out how does the body die? Because there's some evidence that the brain keeps going for a little while, but clinically, for all intents and purposes, dead. Well, during that time of death, people report, not everyone, a small percentage of the population, they report having experiences, highly sensory experiences. The most common one is seeing a bright light at the end of a tunnel, being guided by a loved one, a familiar family member. and at some point being told that they have to come back. Usually they'll get to a point of transition, like a bridge or a roadway or something, and they'll be told that they have to come back, and then they get sucked back into their bodies. Now that's a very common near-death experience, but the idea is that they experience a kind of life after death, and they come back then to tell us about it. So these are people that end up surviving clinical death, and they come back with a memory of this. Now, there's some that argue that we all have these experiences, but once we get filtered back into our bodies, we just don't remember them. But for all intents and purposes, when you're dead, but you have some sort of experience, and then you come back, that's a near-death experience.
There you go. That's a short
That was really long answer to a short
That
question.
was good.
Yeah.
So my grandfather had a near-death experience when he was in his early 20s. He was playing baseball and basically got smashed in the face with a baseball badly and blacked out. And he just remembers seeing the most beautiful light. It wasn't necessarily the light at the end of the tunnel, but just this light that he could not put words to. And he was like, there's no earthly word that could describe how gorgeous this light was or what color it was. And to hear, he was a World War II general, he's sheriff of his town, like very no-nonsense guy. To hear him talk about this was really interesting. And still it didn't, kind of take over his faith. He still doesn't really believe in anything. And I'm not particularly close with him on an emotional level, so I don't know how he feels, as he's getting older, leading toward the next life or whatever. But so getting back to my original question, what's it like seeing people with faith going into death versus not faith going into death?
So interesting, because one thing I want to say. One thing I want to say is that you don't necessarily need to have faith to have a good end of life experience, and there's really cool research on even children's near-death experiences where there are children. There's one that I remember really well that I really love, research done by Melvin Morse, where a little boy had a near-death experience, and he came from a non-religiously observant family, and he had a spirit guide in the afterlife that was a bumblebee. And he went to a place that was full of pets and sweet animals, and he went down a rainbow noodle. I mean, there were these things that were not really like religious icons. So one of the theories that starts to come out of this is that your consciousness is actually what creates your afterlife transition. So if you're a person that loves really sensory things like a walk in a lush green forest, that might be what the afterlife looks like for you. Or if you're a Catholic that has a lot of religious iconography around your house, then quite commonly we see Catholics having Virgin Mary near-death experiences or Christ near-death experiences. So, it's interesting what you see versus what the research says. And I wouldn't say... I'd say that mostly the deaths that I've seen have been peaceful. I think actually when you start dying, you're in a whole different place. So a lot of the anxiety goes away and you're just existing and your body is working really hard. As you approach that, so people that are on hospice, which is usually when a person is in the last 6 weeks of life, let's say, or 6 months. 6 months to 6 weeks, depending. Usually people enroll too late. So as they're getting closer to death, that's when you see anxiety, and that's when you see people feeling like, what's going to happen? Maybe I should believe in something. I don't believe in something. On the contrary, you also see religious people that believe in hell being very concerned about going to hell. So I don't think having an afterlife belief necessarily correlates with having a peaceful death experience. I think it's about the support you have around you as you approach that place. If you have religious people in your life, it's so important to have clergy at the bedside that are reassuring and helping to guide that transition. And, we don't die in Western society the way that I think death was meant to happen. I think death should be a communal experience. It should be one that's full of love. I highly believe that children should be educated about death. They should be able to watch these transitions happen. They should be able to say goodbye to their parents and understand what death means from a physical perspective. The body stops working. Mommy can't eat or breathe or go to sleep. Sometimes kids get thrown off when you say they went to sleep or they went far away. So I think we kind of do a disservice to ourselves and our children thinking that we can't handle death, when actually we know that the more prepared people are, the more they have a frame to understand death, loved ones are going to be less anxious, and the people dying themselves, as they head into that journey that, you can only go through alone, as they head there, they feel supported and they feel like everything's going to be okay. And then they cross that threshold and whatever happens, happens.
Wow.
Yeah. I've heard a common theme with people that are dying is that with a lot of people, and correct me if I'm wrong, but with a lot of people, the thing that worries them is, is everyone else going to be okay? Mm-hmm. And I mean, experiences of, my grandfather, when he was dying, first of all, was still actively teaching and grading papers. And at the end of his last year of teaching, he finished grading the last paper and then got into bed and never got out of bed again. Couldn't walk after that, but was in bed for a long time.
That's an academic right there. Let me tell you, that is a true academic. I will not collapse until I have graded. So real.
Yep, very much my grandfather. And so like all of his kids visited him, but one of his children lived far away, and so he just like was bedridden for a long, long time. And she came and visited him, was finally able to make it into the country, and he saw her and was like, I've been waiting for you. And basically, I think the next day he died. Yeah. And so it's so much of like, I need to make sure that everyone else is going to be okay before I'm willing to leave. And it's weird to look into how much choice people have over when they die. Like when it comes down to the end of it. And I was talking to one of my good friends, Justin, who's in medical school and worked in Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for a year. And he was like, basically all of the staff there, when someone was sick, they could tell you how long they had left or whether they were going to make it through by their attitude. Mm-hmm. Like they're like, with this sickness, it's going to depend on their attitude. And they would leave a room with them, and they'd like make some sort of like a macabre joke about like, oh well, they're not going to be here long. And so much of it is about the way that you think, which is just weird to me because people like to think of death as like, oh, it just happens to you. You can't control it.
No choice involved. But then you have cases of old couples who one dies and then 2 days later the other one follows.
It's a classic, and I think that also like there's a misnomer that so I do think we have choice, and I think that we oftentimes we see. My dad used to call it the Erica effect. When I first started working in end of life, I was like, Dad, this weird thing happens. People get better, like they get a lot of energy, and everyone gets excited, and the loved ones are so excited, and then they die. And, everyone's really confused because they thought they were getting better. And, like, this is something, my dad was like, well, I've never heard of that before. Let's call it the Erica effect. I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm not killing people. I don't want to, get across anything. But it's actually quite common that people experience this surge of energy before they die. And it can be a little bit misleading. And I do think attitude has a lot to do with it. We've had a lot of experiences in working with children where children sometimes need permission to let go. Sometimes they won't die in front of their parents, and it's a hard thing to talk about, but sometimes they're so worried about their parents that even if they're unconscious and they seem to not be hearing anything, we know that auditory is the last sense to go. So, we'll often say, it's okay. Mom and dad are going to be okay. And we encourage parents to tell their kids that so that they can leave. And so sometimes they actually have to leave the room. And that's really hard because, of course, parents want to be with their little ones. Yeah. But I also think that, when it's time, it's time. And so one of the things I don't like is when people say, like, you can overcome this. And they kind of give the idea that somehow people are responsible. All they have to do is think positive and they're going to overcome death or they're going to overcome cancer, and there's no blame ever. There's no blame ever when anyone dies. It is a human natural process, and we can absolutely control to a certain degree how we approach it, but we can't stop it, So I always like to make that distinction that it's not something that just like thinking positive is going to get you through, but when it's our time, it's our time.
Yeah, I was just talking the other day about that like last wind thing that people experience, and I had never.
First, I'm really hearing about it.
I had never heard of it before, like a week ago. But after I heard about it, I remembered when my grandfather, other grandfather this time, when he passed, he was in hospice for a while. He could barely speak. And then singing was a big part of my mom's family growing up. And so they all gathered together and were gonna sing with him, or sing to him before he went. And when they started singing, he sat up in bed and sung full voice with them. And he had a really, really beautiful voice, sung full voice with them that night for like an hour. And I mean, afterward couldn't speak. Before, for days and days and days, couldn't speak at all. And then soon after, he died.
Right, so like, what is that?
Which is like,
what does that say spiritually?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with that. Why that happens? It's like your body's like, all right,
last hurrah.
I'm gonna go. I've got all this leftover energy. You might as well just spend it all in one go. I don't know. It's very strange.
Like you have $15 left in the bank, so you spend it all.
Yeah, exactly.
Good to
Might as
go.
well.
Yeah, well, I think the new church, I've always liked the new church's stance on death and the afterlife. I thought it's always really seemed like a peaceful sort of progressive process. And that, we're all spiritual people right now existing in the spiritual world. And as we get closer to death, I think there's some semblance of us feeling our real selves in the spiritual world more as we cross over.
Yeah.
And so we wake up in the next life and go about our whole afterlife process. But it being more progressive as you get closer to death, I think makes sense with people who are kind of passing away peacefully over a course of time.
And also, one of the things that drew me to the new church was the afterlife theology, because I had worked with children that passed away. I loved so much what Swedenborg had to say about what happens to children in heaven and how sweet it was. And also, I loved looking at early childhood as a point where children still have a connection with angels and that they have that heavenly sphere around them. And I see that in young children, in healthy young children. But I think it's really comforting for parents when they experience the loss of a child to know that those children have a lot of angels around them. I mean, it's really beautiful. Like, just talking about it, I get shivers, because I think it's so precious for them to know that these children, I said earlier, this is a process that we can only do alone. Death is the only thing we can do alone. But for them to be guided by these angel spirits is just so beautiful and so comforting. I wish more people knew about that kind of stuff,
Well, how did that change for you based on your sort of academic study and your passion about death and then bringing that religious aspect in? Did that shift things for you? Or?
Well, so comfortable. It's so comforting to me. So comforting.
But it aligned with kind of what you were...
I think so. So, when I was at Bernathen College, I really felt a freedom to study these things. And I really felt like I was living in a community. And one of the reasons why I work at Rutgers, but I still live here in this Swedenborgian community, is because the writings of Swedenborg and the philosophy of the new church have done so much for me, so much for my anxiety. And I am a woman of science. I write research protocols. I teach research. I taught research methods at Bernathen. I got some good street cred. But, this argument, like this false dichotomy between science and spirituality is bullshit. It's not real. It's not real. And focusing on that and the objective truth is not going to get us anywhere. And I think for me, the new church gave me answers that once I heard them, once my husband, who was born into the new church, told me about this theology, there was this intrinsic this makes so much sense. It makes so much sense. And so for me, it's been tremendously comforting. And what's cool is, I was at a conference in Atlantic City this weekend. I was talking about some of the beliefs of the community that I live in. And I was talking to social workers from across New Jersey and telling them about this stuff. And there's always a little bit of are people going to there's these writings. And people were really, especially the people that worked in end of life that I was lecturing to, they got it. They got it, and it wasn't strange. So for those of us that have been close to death, it's not so weird, and it doesn't seem so fantastic that these things could be true. And why not believe in them? So it's done an enormous amount for me spiritually, how I talk to my kids about death and teach them about death, both from the natural physical side and the spiritual side, has had tremendous value. So my kids my son who has these big thoughts like I do, and he says these things at 5, like, everything ends. We will all end. You know, like these big
And you're like, okay,
thoughts.
here's your
Like,
lunch.
right. See you later. Right.
Get
Now
going to
go
school.
play Nintendo Switch. Right. Yeah. But I can have these talks with him in his language from a developmentally appropriate way where he doesn't have to be afraid of death. And he talks about, we had a baby that passed away before he was born, and he talks about meeting Darby when he goes to heaven and after he lives a good life. And, he can talk about his angel brother in a way that is normal and comforting to him and our family. And that allows us to keep Darby in our lives too. So personally, spiritually, and academically, I think it's really enriched, and it also honors every person that I work with as a clinician, as a writer, every life that I touch. It's brought tremendous peace and value to my life. So, yeah.
That's tremendous.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
One thing I really have been thinking about recently, so I was reading a couple just sort of testimonials about people, and I was reading this one very interesting testimonial, and getting back to that thing about like auditory is the last thing to go. Reading this interesting thing about a group of siblings around their dad who was dying, and he died, and one person said like he's going to be with mom now, it's going to be okay, and then he came back and he was like, yeah, I was with mom, and she said like she wasn't ready for me yet. And so he's like, so I'm going to stick around a bit.
She wanted some more time living single in the afterlife.
And so like
she's for you.
So what fascinated me about that is not only could he hear what they were saying, but he at least reported also having connections with people who are long since dead.
Oh yeah.
So this really strange in-between state where it wasn't like I was somewhere else. It was like I was here, but a lot of other stuff was here too.
Yes.
And it's really fascinating lining up with new church teachings about sort of what you said, how we are spirits and we have connection to a spiritual world. And in the Bible, it talks about people's spiritual eyes being opened and them seeing things they didn't see before. Yeah. And that's always what near-death experience has sounded like to me.
Yeah.
It's just so fascinating to look at it as not so much like we die and then we travel somewhere else, but rather we die and then we just open our eyes and realize what has been around the whole time. It seems like that idea of traveling could be really scary. Like leaving what you have to go somewhere foreign could be really scary. And the idea of like, you're not really going anywhere. Things are changing for sure. And there's a lot of fear around that. I mean, change is the biggest thing that people are scared of.
Absolutely.
And so in no way am I trying to like say people shouldn't be scared of dying.
Right.
It's really scary.
Right.
The times that I have thought about death and other people dying and their fear and fear I might have, the idea of it not being I am no longer here but somewhere else.
Yes.
Being like, I'm still here and the people that have died before me are still here. They're not gone forever.
Yeah.
Not only will maybe one day I'll see them after I die, but they're affecting my life now too. And that's just been really cool stuff I've been thinking about recently.
Well, it makes me think as well, some of the research I've done here in our community is on spiritually transformative experiences. And so this can be like after death communication, like when you get a message from the great beyond, or any kind of spiritual experience that changes your life. People can have these near-death type experiences without also being clinically dead. So actually, one of the most common ways to enter those experiences is through sleep. And they call it like it's the hypnagogic state. It's like you're not quite awake and you're not quite asleep. Like, I don't know if you've ever woken up from a dream and you still kind of feel like you're in the dream. And things still feel a little bit like maybe you don't quite know where you are, but you know you're somewhere. You feel yourself, but you kind of almost experience a temporary loss of memory. And you're just consciousness. And so people describe having reunions with loved ones that have died. One story that stuck with me that was so beautiful was a woman in our community who entered through sleep this whole world of afterlife, and she met up with her mother who had died when she was a child. and they walked together through a forest and they danced together, and she described this really vivid imagery, and she knew that while she'd entered this experience through sleep, she wasn't asleep. She knew she was in another world. And her mother at the end said to her, I'm not going to be able to see you for a while, but you're going to be okay. And she kind of walked up a long staircase, and that connected her back to her sleeping body. Wow. And then she woke up back in this life. And she was a little girl when it happened, and it brought her really this tremendous comfort. But she didn't have to die to experience it. This was just something that happened to her while she was sleeping. Sometimes people have these experiences when they're meditating too, or if they've had like a blow to the head, for example. Maybe they don't clinically die, but something like is jolted in them. So it's pretty cool to see that, like this stuff is probably all around us, and it's just how do you access it?
So I gotta ask then, in my life and times, I've never had a near-death experience or any explicit contact with the spiritual world. I've wanted to, like I've there are definitely parts of my life where I want to see a ghost or something like that.
Yeah.
And I've talked about that before. But have you ever experienced anything like that? I could imagine that being part of your process of study and stuff, but I don't know.
I've had what I would call some signs. And what's interesting is when I talk to grieving people, they're like, I'm looking for them. And I've come to understand that the harder you look, the less you're going to see them. Yeah. These are things that kind of spontaneously show up. So I've never had a near-death experience, but one of the coolest things that's happened to me in my life was I associate my first pregnancy, my first baby that I lost, with a crow. I really love birds, and I really love big black crows. And last year, on the anniversary of Darby's death, a friend called me, and she knows that I take wildlife to our local animal rescue center, which is kind of a little bit of a trek, but I love doing it. I love rescuing lost and injured animals. And so it was August 3rd, and my friend called me. She said, I think there's something in my yard for you. And I was like, what? And she's like, there's an injured crow on my doorstep. And I'm wondering if you could take it to the Ark. And I got there, and it was just the weirdest thing that on this day of all days, and she had the crow in this carrier, and I had this crow sitting beside me on this journey to this animal rescue place. And I had this moment of, that's a sign. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't expecting it. I've never had a sign on August 3rd before that's been so clear. But to me, that was just one of those moments of deep knowing, like, okay, that's something beyond what I can fully explain. And I think people can rationalize, this is coincidence, and there's a statistical likelihood that these things can happen.
You're a woman of science.
I'm right, so, and I think so for those of us that have the experiences, and this is similar for people that have near-death experiences, when you know, and even William James, who is the father of American psychology, also affiliated with the New Church, he said this wonderful thing about people that have experienced spiritual experiences and near-death experiences. He said, your arguments, be they never so logical, will not convince people that they haven't had the experience. So science stops mattering. Logic and reason stops mattering. When you know, and nothing can take away that experience from you. And it's very true. So that's the closest I've gotten. I don't know have you ever had any kind of communication or...
So I've had some weird things happen to me, but I do want to say one thing I've always found baffling, that I've really come into being even more baffled by recently, is when people have these experiences that are really impactful to them. I guess what it comes down to is if you're talking about was it coincidence? Was it a sign? Who was that sign from? Blah, blah, blah. Was it real or not? That whole question. I guess I always come back to why does it matter?
I was thinking the same
Why does it matter?
Yeah.
And it seems like there are so many people that are so quick to be like, but that doesn't have to be. It could have been anything. It's always like, why do people feel the need to explain away an experience that really meant something to someone? Mm-hmm. So I think people have an over excitement to try to rationalize. And I fall into that, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Natural skeptic you are.
Yeah.
And that keeps us safe, I think. I think humans crave predictability, You know, you said change is one of the scariest things in life. I think loss of control for people is tremendously terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
In order for us to thrive and find meaning in our lives and create healthy relationships, we need to feel like we're in control. And death and talking about things that we can't explain, I think, creates a tremendous amount of anxiety in people because there's no control over it and there's no explanation. So that, as much as it's hard, you know, you have to tell people, like, if there's meaning in this for you, then go with it. And that's what I tell my students. I teach spirituality at the doctoral level. I taught psychology and spirituality at Bernathen College. The whole message of that course was, if people create meaning from these experiences, then that is what matters.
Yeah.
And so I guess getting back to like things that have happened to me.
Oh, can I say one thing before you go into
Yeah,
that?
go for it.
Was last week on the podcast we talked about, I think people are desperate to know things spiritually, but the only rule set they have to figure that stuff out is an earthly rule set. And that's not, like, you can't use earthly rules to apply to the spiritual world because they just operate by a different set of rules.
Yes.
So I think that's where people
Exactly.
struggle to figure that stuff out. So it's like, this doesn't make sense. This can't have meaning. Well,
Yes.
we don't know the rules for this other place perfectly.
Yes,
So.
and there's a theory behind that too. We keep like bouncing off. You keep bringing up good points, and then we keep elaborating, and then you never get to talk. So this is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I want to hear about your spooky experiences. Charles Tart, who is a psychologist that
Great
studies
name.
this kind of stuff, right? Tart, delicious,
Yeah.
and has some delicious ideas about this.
Good
And what he
segue.
actually says is Tart's theory of altered consciousness. And what he says is that the logic of one realm cannot be applied to the logic of another. You cannot compare the two realities. So the way I explain that to my students is, when you're having a dream, everything in dream rationale makes total sense. You could be teeny tiny 1 minute and then huge, and then you're flying. But when you try to relay the reality of that dream to your friend that wasn't in the dream in waking life, it makes no sense and it sounds stupid. And I feel like that's so true of other states of consciousness, is like, we just don't have the language or the physical lived experience to connect them. So like, why are we even trying? Let's just
Yeah.
honor your experience, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
spooky stuff. Go.
So that's
Actually, we had a spiritual episode on.
jerk. So I think we did have an episode on ghosts, though.
Yeah.
Interesting. The further I get away from experiences that I can't explain, the more my skeptical mind like tries to shove them down.
Isn't that interesting in and of itself?
Yeah. It's like I don't really even fully believe them anymore. But anyway, when I was a kid at one point, I was like 13, I thought I saw like a kid playing on the playground really late at night, and then like looked away and looked back and he was gone, kind of spookiness.
Did you
And
hear
then-
ring around the room? I feel like that's always in the movie. The spinning like the merry-go-round. Did that happen?
Just a music box.
Right.
was-
Ding, ding, ding.
There was a very stereotypical one swing not moving, one swing moving.
classic.
though. So I was like,
I'm out
nope,
here.
I'm going home. But then the only experience that wasn't just like, oh, that was kind of weird and spooky, was after my mom's dad died. It was right before I went to a camp, and the camp had nightly like Vespers services. And I was sort of like grappling with him dying. I wasn't super close to him. And I got like very kind of sleepy and very, very like meditative. And then my mind sort of just kind of went clear. And then I just had this really like very warm, calm feeling that was like almost brought me to tears. I didn't cry because I was like 13, and that would have been
Too
the end of
tough.
the world
Yeah.
for me in front of all my friends. Ugh. For some reason, my mind just immediately was like, "Oh, this is my grandfather," and I was sort of immediately like, "Why would I think that?" But so that was really just, I don't really know what to make of that or why. But again, my skeptical mind can be like, "I don't know, just think about that, and it was moving music, and that's fine,
Sure.
whatever."
Right.
But felt like more impactful than something that didn't have more going on. So yeah, that was always something. It was always weird to me because like I never felt connected to my grandfather.
Although what I've learned as my parents have now become grandparents is that there is a tremendous affection for grandchildren, and I'm not at all surprised that you felt that warmth. You know, that's they say sometimes that the depth of love that you feel when your children have children is like, it's too much. And so, yeah, you saw him in Waking Life, and it was just like he was a normal dude, but he sent that love to you, and what a wonderful way for it to manifest. And yeah, who cares if that was real or not? I mean, I think we have these spiritual experiences all the time. I think we listen when we get goosebumps, or we listen to a beautiful piece of music and it moves us beyond words, or like love, just the concept of love, that is a spiritual experience, and we're capable of feeling it in some way that, again, is intangible. And our little, our prefrontal cortexes that are all rational and planning, and like our little executives that want to make meaning of it, really struggle with that, because these visceral experiences, they just are, and I think we're a little bit too quick to dismiss them.
Yeah. Well, and it is interesting how over time that prefrontal cortex kind of takes over and downplays and pushes down the things that have happened that might have been more spiritual. So it's interesting that sort of spiritual side is almost more short term than the logical, rational. Like even when I was really young, my grandma passed away, and then probably like a year later, I remember having a very vivid, what I thought was a dream, where I sort of visited with her, and we were in a very beautiful, like, garden, sort of rocky area. And
so you have had a spiritual experience.
But at this point, I'm like, no, it was just a dream. Like, right now, I can't say for sure that it was that, because I've been so far away from it that it could have just been a dream.
Is that because you need to be in control of it, Luke?
I don't know. I
mean, you're learning.
Definitely could.
Look at this.
I listen.
Like a lecture.
$40 copay.
Right now, how much does he owe me at this point?
Yeah. I'm just auditing. It's fine.
I don't know. I mean, it definitely could come down to a subconscious control. But also, I really consciously want to be more spiritually, like, have those experiences. So I don't know.
Yeah. I've thought about that. Like, why don't weird things happen to me? I've had that thought too. And also, for me, when I really examine it, a lot of that is like when there are things that I'm like, I don't know, it's just kind of happened. I kind of like, I don't like it.
Yeah,
I'm like, I don't
uncomfortable.
know.
It doesn't fit into my worldview.
Yeah, I want to fit that somewhere. Even though like it does fit into my worldview. Like it fits into my spiritual worldview, but still I'm
more than most.
Right.
No.
Right.
No. So it's just so weird that I think that your idea of control really, like, for me, felt like it hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah.
And also freedom. Like, for me, it's like we have to be in freedom to make these decisions for ourselves and to wrestle with them and to make use of these things and to use them for the betterment of ourselves and others, or to use them to be hurtful or to push them away. I mean, we have the choice. And I think,
that's so important.
Like if we all walked around with a connection to the beyond, where's the spiritual growth? Where's the
humanity?
Where's the humanity? A lot of the lesson for me in my journey as death expert has been to like really be okay with having the anxiety and having the question and not knowing and really trying to make meaning and really like take that leap of faith. And that's still something that I have trouble doing. I mean, I do that same thing too, like the crow thing. Well, it was just a crow. So, I mean, I think we have to constantly push ourselves to go to that next level because I think when we have that openness, again, it connects us more to humanity and it helps us, I think, love people better because we all have this common
And what's
weird
the downside
experience.
of it, too?
Yeah, there ain't no downside.
There ain't no downside.
As long as, and I will say there's some people that report really terrible spiritual experiences and terrible near-death experiences. They're not all smiles and sunshine, man. Some are really dark.
Yeah.
And there's a lesson in those too. So there's this element of these communications and of near-death experiences and final words that have some sort of lesson in them for people to take back to humanity and to make humanity better.
Wow.
Yeah.
I just remembered an experience I had with an older woman. I had just given a presentation to sort of in a community event, and she came up and was thanking me for the presentation, and she sort of off the cuff was like, yeah, my husband told me that it was going to be really good and that I should go, and he wasn't wrong. And I was like, oh, like, do I know him? And she's like, oh, no, like, he's been gone for a while. And I was like, oh.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh. And she's like, yeah, he passed away about 10 years ago.
Wow.
But, he visits me almost every day. And we talk pretty much at the end of every day, and he sits by my bed, and we have conversations. And I just didn't know.
How do you respond to that?
I didn't know how to respond to that. Yeah, cool.
All right.
I don't know how to handle that.
Right.
Awesome for you.
Is it always like meaningful conversation? Like at that point when he's there every day, it's like, so I'm here.
What's really
Like,
happened?
you just sit there and it's like, well,
Finished a
do you have
puzzle.
to-
Do we have
Finished a
arguments?
puzzle today.
Right. Yeah. Like, do you fight? What do
Yeah.
you fight about?
Yeah, I just didn't know how to.
Wow.
And at the time, and still now, again, I really struggle with skepticism, but I can't be like, no, he doesn't.
Yeah.
You're just old. Like, it's not, like, she...
Got her.
Say it like that too.
Yeah. And, I probably shouldn't use that tone.
No.
Whether it is true or not felt so irrelevant to me in that moment, sort of
Yeah.
getting back to that idea, because clearly I saw how much positive effect it has on her life. I like to differentiate between fact and truth. And fact can be proven with evidence. Fact can be you can use the scientific method on fact. But I think truth is a much bigger thing. And I think for her, there was the truth that this was really helpful to her.
Yeah.
The truth that she felt a connection to her husband consistently throughout her life, even though he had passed on. And that, like, nothing I could say would make that less true for her.
Right.
Or less true objectively, not even for her. Yeah, and I think bringing that back to our topic about near-death experiences, I think there are so many times where I've read studies about near-death experiences that are like, oh, well, actually, as the person was dying, we examined, the firings of the neurons
Sure.
in the brain,
Certain
and
parts.
the brain firing in that way would create those hallucinations.
Right.
And it's like, first of all, that might be true, and I'm okay with that there is firing in the brain that creates visions. Second of all, I don't think that makes a higher thing that they're realizing from that any less true. And third of all, what's the use in trying to be like, that was just your brain doing stuff?
Right.
What do you gain from doing that? What does the world gain from that?
What if we could tap into that and then people could have more pleasant experiences? There's a lot of discussion about a God spot in the brain. And, so many classes that I teach focus on this. Is spirituality something humans naturally have in their brains, or is it passed down through evolution? And how can we teach people to be more spiritual, or is it something we just do?
Cultural.
If we can tap into that part of the brain that creates or perhaps is a filter for these experiences. I mean, we still know so little about the brain, and we're learning more and more every day. But there's this possibility that, like, okay, cool. So if we're all capable of experiencing this, and people can have better end-of-life experiences, even if it's coming through the material brain, like, let's do it.
And it doesn't mean that God's not
It
doing
doesn't
it.
disprove God.
Yeah,
Like,
I think people can use that example and be
Right.
like, well, here are these neurons firing, activating this area, so your experience isn't spiritual. Well,
Right.
If God's the creator of stuff, like, he's probably got that in his plan, right?
That's like so
that
minute
doesn't
for God.
disprove-
That's like, I created the brain,
Yeah.
like this, like I sneezed and there it was. It's like such an afterthought. Like these complex things that humans cannot figure out is
Yeah.
like nothing to,
Yeah. It's
know,
like-
eternity.
When people are like, oh, well, love is just hormone production. I'm like, hormone production helps us feel love.
Right.
Glad there are hormones that help us deal with that.
Anyway, my dudes, I feel like we should start to wrap up here.
Wow.
Yeah,
Oh my
it's getting
goodness.
late.
We've been talking for
We
a long
were
time.
without a watch,
We've
so...
been, we've been gabbing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cut him.
Have
Tell you
we?
guys to shut up for a minute. So
I was looking for a spot. Before we end, I do think it'd be helpful, Erica, to give you a chance to address any people out there who maybe are watching this and are scared about death, because I know you deal with that a lot.
Yeah.
And maybe Rich and I aren't particularly scared in the same sort of way as people you see, but I do
Yeah.
think that'd be a nice little gift to give if you don't mind.
Yeah, all I can tell you is, first of all, it's normal and you're going to be okay. You will be okay. All will be well. There are a lot of therapists now that are able to deal with thanatophobia. There are a lot of spiritual orientations. There are a lot of big questions that you probably have. and there's also an infinite amount of answers out there. And if you could have told me at age 6 that someone would be calling me a death expert and that I would feel such tremendous peace right now in what I do know about death, I wouldn't have believed it. And that doesn't mean that I don't struggle every day with death anxiety, but life is really good, and death is okay, and everything is going to be okay. That's the best thing I can say, and I'll take another $40 copay.
There you go. It's all about that cash, baby.
Yeah.
I do think you should get death expert just tattooed right here.
It would be another great tattoo, for sure, and really subtle. So
Yeah. I love that title, though.
Some really metal lettering.
Yeah, I'm picturing some really
like
death
gothic,
metal,
like
grungy.
yeah.
It'd be sweet. It'd be sweet. Cool.
Well, this has been super fun.
Yeah, this has been great.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much
This
for
has been
coming on.
wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
I always feel after we have our conversations with our guests that I feel more spiritually connected and like firing a little bit. So
Yeah,
thank you for giving me that. That's
My
great.
pleasure. I'm so grateful that you guys invited me on, and I think that again, death anxiety is something that people really get afraid to talk about. So giving it a spotlight, a space, and to actually go down that spiritual path, and to just let people know that there's definitely hope. And yeah, thank you. This has been so much fun.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to plug before we close out officially?
Oh my goodness.
Any new books you're
I have a
making?
couple of articles, but probably your audience isn't going to be delving into the academic literature anytime soon. But if anyone is interested in a doctorate in social work, check out Rutgers University. And if you're local to Philly, the Center for Growth has a lot of great counseling resources for you and a lot of really wonderful clinicians outside of myself. And for grieving teen siblings, grieving for the sibling you lost is still the only self-help book available for teens that have suffered the loss of a brother or sister or sibling by any gender. So check those out, and thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right.
And if you're not already, make sure you are downloading our podcast wherever you find them, on Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Google Play, whatever. Smash that subscribe button.
Smash that.
YouTube.
Please. If you have any questions about this episode or just in general about the topic, or have anything you want us to talk about in the future, feel free to comment below our YouTube video or send us an email at spiritablepodcast@gmail.com. Check us out on Facebook or Twitter and Instagram.
Instagram's
Instagram's fun.
Instagram's the best one.
Yeah.
Take that,
Follow us on
Twitter.
Wait, what's the Instagram again?
Instagram's Grand Human Project.
Grand Human
That's where we put
Project.
our edgy church stuff.
Ooh, edgy church, yeah.
Go check it out.
All right.
Good enough?
Edgy church.